And thank you to our panelists. And I'm really grateful, and it's my honor to introduce Matt Sandgren. Matt is a good friend. He was Senator Orrin Hatch's chief of staff for many years, leading the senator's office and supporting the senator through some of the most productive years that the senator had back in Washington, D.C. Matt then left to set up the Hatch Center, an organization that's focusing on moving the ball forward on a broad range of policy issues. Matt spends his time in Washington, D.C., but sometimes we get him out here in Utah. And so, Matt, thank you so much for partnering with us on the China Paradox. Thank you for organizing this panel discussion. And I'll go ahead and kick it over to you to introduce the panelists and then to take the discussion from there.
Thank you, Miles. It's always good to see you, and it's great to be back in Utah today. And thank you to Ambassador Huntsman and Matt Pottinger and Boyd for their extremely important and expert insights on China. That opening session was fantastic, so thank you for that. As Miles said, the Orrin G. Hatch Foundation is pleased to partner with the World Trade Center on this important webinar series. And to give you a view from Washington, we've assembled this panel, a team of experts, really China experts, thought leaders, and former policy makers, to give us their take on Congress and the decisions coming out of Washington. Joining us today, we have Senator Mary Landrieu, the former chair of the Senate Energy Committee, Congressman Howard Berman, the former chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Congressman Charles Boustany, a former member of the House Ways and Means Committee, and Marty Gold, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Whether it was in the United States Senate or the House of Representatives, each of them has had a direct hand in directing U.S. China policy over the last decade. So with those brief introductions, I really just want to jump right in. We have so much to cover, and I just can't underscore how fortunate we are to have such a seasoned panel for them to be with us today. So thank you for joining us. I know it's a busy time, and for them to take time out of their schedules to zoom in. I want to begin with you, Senator Landrieu. As I mentioned, you served on the Senate Energy Committee for many years, and you served as the committee's chair. And so you've worked on with a number of foreign nations on climate change and on clean energy policies, and that also includes China, which, as our listeners may know, has the largest carbon footprint in the world. So my first question to you is, it's been historically difficult to work with China in reducing the impact of climate change. Can you tell us why that is and give us your take on the future prospects in working with China?
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, Matt, so much. And it was a pleasure working with you for many years when you were in DC. And I agreed to do this not only because of the friends on the panel today, particularly Charles Boustany, who he and I represented the same state, as you know, for many years, but Marty Gold and the chairman as well, but also because of my deep respect for Senator Orrin Hatch and the work that he did for years trying to build bipartisan solutions to some of the most important problems, whether it was from education to trade to foreign policy. And, his relationships with key Democrats is, legendary, and the work that he did along with his own party. So I want to, acknowledge him and in large measure encouraging me to be a part of this. I would say that one of the reasons we've had difficulty working with China in the past on energy and environment is because we've had a little bit of a problem in this country getting consensus about what we want to do. The politics of this has changed rapidly, I think, in the United States, in the last 5 to 6 years. And it's really interesting to see the business community of the United States leaning forward. I'm talking about the Chamber of Commerce. I'm talking about API. I'm talking about, more conservative business leaders and some of the leaders of the Republican Party really leaning into recognizing and not dismissing this issue as important for our country. And so as there's a better consensus in the US, not that there's uniform agreement, but is there better consensus in the US that yes, this is a problem, this is what we have to do, these are some new technologies, new solutions, I think we'll be better positioned to work with China. Having said that, President Biden feels like he's got a good relationship with the leadership to us as well as I guess anyone could have, and there's some real issues there. Senator Kerry, who is now the global, our global outreach czar, has a good relationship. So, there's some promising, promising aspects to work with China more. However, I want to say in closing, not to filibuster here, but I am really glad to be reminded of the paradox and the real serious challenge with China and the way they're thinking about autocratic governments being better than democracies, top-down approach being better than the bubble-up approach that we believe in, their contradictions to our values. I really think this is a serious issue, as the ambassador outlined, as Matt has led as an advisor to President Trump. I think his impact has been extraordinary. His vision is very, I think, good for us. So for those that got to watch the first panel, while I'm want to be hopeful and find that we maybe can work with China, particularly on new technologies. They have to do carbon sequestration. We have to do more carbon sequestration. Like Joe Manchin said, it's not about keeping it in the ground or eliminating anything. It's about addition, not subtraction. But still, China's being very aggressive. And I think we have to be careful. We want to work with them. We need to work together, clean up the atmosphere and cool the planet. But I do think we need to do it with eyes wide open about the fact they do not share many of our values.
Well said, Senator, and we'll circle back on that as we continue the conversation. I want to move over to Congressman Berman. We have worked for years when Senator Hatch was in office. I in particular worked very closely with your team on all things related to intellectual property. I was an old Senate Judiciary hand and just have such deep respect for your work on intellectual property. So I want to drill in a little on that topic with you today to give our listeners just an idea about the pervasiveness of intellectual property theft worldwide. More than a quarter of American companies claim that China has stolen their IP in the last decade. This can be anything from trade secrets, copyrighted materials, to patented biopharmaceuticals and software design. So there's a lot going on. And so I want to turn to you, Congressman, and ask you, when it comes to intellectual property and China, what keeps you up at night? What do you think about how can we improve those relations? Is there any hope on the horizon?
Well, thank you very much. And in large part, like the senator mentioned, part of my interest in accepting your invitation to participate was my own respect for the work of Senator Hatch on the issues you specifically focused on in intellectual property. We worked on a bipartisan basis regularly, and I would argue that the issue of intellectual property in China isn't just a 10-year phenomenon. It goes much, much further back than that. It is a larger issue that keeps me up at night, not just the intellectual property. Let me focus on one aspect of it, because I was a congressman from Los Angeles, and as you might imagine, there is a particular focus on the copyright community there and the film industry, the music industry, issues of importance there. Things have changed very dramatically. China has always been a problem, but the problem of 20 and 25 years ago of counterfeit products being sold on street corners and in the back of stores, and huge numbers of people in China who could afford to having access to these counterfeit goods. It's a much more sophisticated issue now. It is about a Chinese government and leadership that has created all these conditions to U.S. companies working in China and finding Chinese partners. The intellectual property theft coming in part through the creation of these conditions for doing business in China. And It's a much more sophisticated and very serious problem in the intellectual property world. But in terms of, it is the larger relationship. And I do think the earlier discussion with the ambassador and Matt Pottinger made a very interesting point. A totalitarian government became more like an authoritarian government in many ways during after Mao's passing and starting in the late 70s and 80s. It became more open. Yes, the Communist Party was the leader, and there was no contest to that, but individuals had more individual freedom and space. One has a sense, particularly with the current regime, Xi Jinping, that it is moving back into a much more totalitarian space. And how the United States works our affirmative policies to deal with the problems of theft of intellectual property, and how we formulate our policies and the need for allies to work with on this, I think is one of the major issues confronting this country.
Thank you for that. I obviously will circle back. There's a lot to dig in on the IP front as well, but thank you, Congressman. That was very insightful. Dr. Boustany, you are a published, a very accomplished author on all things related to China. Very, very impressive. And I want to talk a little about with you the supply chain issues. China has been hoarding, it's no secret, they've been hoarding rare earth minerals that are affecting our ability to not only produce lithium batteries, but much of the technology we depend on. Semiconductors are probably one of the top issues of the day, particularly in Washington. You've seen it, the pressures from the auto industry to the data center groups have all come out very concerned about the lack of access to semiconductors. And these are the computer chips. When we say semiconductors, people are like, what are we talking about? We're talking about the computer chips that we use to power everything from our smartphones, data centers, cars, or even our medical supplies, or those areas. So one thing that we've learned from this pandemic is it's underscored just how dependent we are as a nation on China for semiconductors. President Biden just recently signed an executive order last month that effectively calls on a China-free supply chain. Dr. Boustany, why don't you give us a little flavor of what that executive order will mean going forward, especially as it relates to semiconductors?
Well, thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be with you and to join my colleagues in this discussion. The pandemic clearly shed a lot of light on the vulnerabilities that we have with supply chains. It's not just the United States, it's countries around the world. And this is all built up over a matter of the last couple of decades, where China has assumed a very central position in a number of key supply chains. You mentioned, for instance, rare earths. They control 80% of the mined product now because they have done the environmentally degradatory processes and agreed to do those things to gain that kind of supremacy. And of the 20%, for instance, that's mined outside of China, 40% of that goes to manufacturing processes in China. So they hold this very strong leverage with these minerals and the manufacturing that's critical, obviously, for our technology sector. It's significant economic leverage that they carry. And we can talk further about that. But with the semiconductor situation, it's really interesting because a couple of things happened. One, during the pandemic, people were locked in at home. They couldn't spend money on other things. So they started spending money here in the US and around the world on consumer electronics for entertainment purposes. And so there was this huge market demand that grew. And if you couple that with bottlenecks in the supply chain in terms of manufacturing of semiconductors, it suddenly became an acute issue. Secondly, because of sanctions policy on the Chinese semiconductor company, which supplies about 10% of the world's market on not the really high-end semiconductors, but sort of the kinds of things you see in the consumer electronics world, that added more difficulty, more strain on the supply chain. And then thirdly, China, because of sanctions, started to hoard semiconductors and chips for Huawei and for their own purposes, anticipating the problems with these sanctions. So all of these things sort of came together in a confluence to create a shortage. And so now you have the auto industry competing with consumer electronics, and it's created a major problem. Now, more broadly speaking, the United States still holds a significant advantage from an innovation standpoint in semiconductor technology on the really high-end stuff used in defense, in our national defense, in very high-end computing and so forth. It's critically important that we maintain our innovative edge in that. But addressing these immediate supply chain issues will be critically important. And I think the Biden administration's taken an important step forward in ordering an extensive supply chain review and evaluation. And I think what it will do is ultimately lead to policy direction that will look at what do we need to make here in the United States and not rely on the rest of the world. What can we do? What areas can we rely upon allies and other countries, whether it's in North America through our trade agreement with USMCA or working with Japan and Europe and others to share within a broader supply chain. So some, first a regional kind of supply chain, then a more broad global supply chain. And then what areas clearly need to be off limits with regard to China? How do we prevent the technology diffusion that could give them an innovative edge? How do we prevent them, obviously, from going back to what Howard mentioned, stealing technology, which has been a huge problem? And these are going to be policy issues that will, I think, be addressed within the supply chain review with hopefully a broad discussion on what remedies and what steps should be taken.
Well, I want to just push that a little further on that. When you talk about, this plan, do you think we can wean ourselves off of China? Because, I mean, you think about this semiconductors, I mean, this is such a hot issue. It just concerns all, I mean, you talk to any of these industries, like you pointed out, we're all living on Zoom now. That's using the data centers that are helping store the cloud and everything else. Do you have optimism that this can happen?
Well, it's going to be a challenge, no question about it. And what we're dealing with is a situation where we have a strategic competitor in China under circumstances where there's a great degree of interdependence in the areas of technology and of course, trade, finance, and so forth through all these supply chains. This cannot be just reversed immediately. It's going to take stepwise measures to get to a point where we need to be with this to hopefully minimize the technology diffusion and intellectual property theft and the capacity for China to disrupt our grids, for instance, or to conduct surveillance. These are issues we're going to have to address with policy, and it cannot be done unilaterally by the United States. These kinds of policies will have to be implemented with a coalition of the willing, hopefully other democratic market economies that respect rule of law, respect privacy. And so how do you shift that balance? And I think the key in geopolitical terms is to marshal the preponderance of economic strength while we try to maintain our military supremacy, marshal the preponderance of economic strength, set rules, set standards through trade agreements, investment agreements, supply chain agreements, so that China, over a period of some time, will start to see less favorable terms for participation in supply chains, in technology investment. And then in that way, we test their capacity to change. And if they don't, then we continue on that trajectory of isolating them. But we cannot do it. We cannot force them into this. We have to build the coalition to put them on the defensive, to make them realize it's in their interest to change. Otherwise, they are self-selecting isolation and less favorable terms. It's going to be a tall task. And that's why it's going to take some very robust diplomacy to make something like this come together.
That's actually, segues into what I was going to mention on the global coalition that is needed to really tackle some of these very, very thorny issues. I might note that today the Senate confirmed Catherine Tai by a vote of 98-0 as our newest U.S. trade representative. So there shows clearly there's this, not only a bipartisan, it's unanimously supporting her. And we look forward to seeing the good things that she will do on behalf of our country. Thank you, Doctor. I want to shift over to Marty Gold. He is all things experts. When Senator Landrieu mentioned the filibuster, Marty is the expert on all things related to Senate procedure. He's actually written numerous books on the topic. He's not only an expert on Senate policy and procedure, but he's also a Chinese expert. He knows everything about China. And we are just really deeply grateful for him to be here with us today. And I want to turn to him about what's going on in Congress. There's a lot happening, and it's, I counted just this morning that Congress to date has already introduced 56 bills on China. That's a lot of bills. We're only in March, and we're talking 56 bills related to China. Marty, give us a snapshot. What's going on? I know that, I don't want you to filibuster here, so we don't have time to go through all 56 bills, but give us a snapshot give us a flavor of what's going on in Congress. Why is this so hot? And address this, what kind of bills are we seeing? Are these bipartisan? I'm assuming both Republicans and Democrats are working together on this.
Well, thank you, Matt, and good morning to you. I could begin by saying that nobody in China has the right to filibuster. But beyond that, the reason that it's so active in Congress, the reason that Congress is so alive on this problem is that China is an existential challenge to the United States. I am old enough to remember when Sputnik was launched. And I can remember, I was a little bit young to understand the governmental response, but I remember the people's shock when Sputnik was launched, and all of a sudden it became apparent that the Soviet Union had leaped ahead in the space race, and then the United States had to respond to that. Out of that, committees were formed in Congress that dealt primarily with the space program. NASA was begun, and all of a sudden the Apollo program began, and so forth, so that within a decade's time, we landed a person on the moon. But it took an all-of-government response and a public-private partnership, and it became very apparent to people in the Congress that that was necessary, and that is what is necessary now. You have a very polarized situation in Washington. Everybody understands that. The Congress is very polarized. President Biden has undone a number of Trump policies, for example, on the Paris Climate Accords, on the World Health Organization, on border issues and so forth. And yet there is unity in Washington on one topic, and that topic is China. President Biden has not undone Trump tariffs, for example, on China. President Biden has doubled down in terms of looking at vulnerabilities. We mentioned here the executive order on supply chains. They're doing other reviews as well, both in the domestic area and also in the foreign policy and defense area. They are moving very cautiously. Okay? So they are not proceeding on a partisan basis on the executive branch. And in the Congress, there is a very substantial commitment to bipartisan legislation. Look, this is not new in 2021. Just for example, in the last Congress, There were 8 hearings in the House Foreign Affairs Committee on China. There were 4 hearings in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on China, even with the disruptions caused by the pandemic. Okay. One of those hearings I thought was especially interesting. It occurred last September. The witnesses were assistant secretaries for the Far East. That makes some sense. Far East Indo-Pacific, that makes sense. But also from Europe and also from Latin America, because the problem with China is a worldwide problem. It's not a problem confined to the Indo-Pacific region. Okay? So this gives you a sense of how globally Congress is looking at this. Now, 56 pieces of legislation. Many of those are House bills. Many of them have been introduced by Republican members. All the bills have been referred to committee. None will easily move, and yet I would not say that none will move, because they easily can be wrapped into more omnibus pieces of legislation. That's what happens in the National Defense Authorization Act, where bills get picked up and ideas get picked up and things get moved in. So I think the House itself will be quite active, but beyond that, the Senate is going to be hyperactive. Senator Schumer, Majority Leader, has announced that toward the end of April, they will move China legislation on the floor. What does China legislation amount to? Not just his bill, or not just some Republican's bill. It's going to be bipartisan legislation that emanates from multiple Senate committees. The base legislation will be a piece that is being finally negotiated out between him and Senator Todd Young, Republican of Indiana, called the Endless Frontiers Act. That'll be the base bill. That'll be what gets put on the floor. But then Senator Schumer will take the work product of other committees and put that all into a leadership substitute and offer that. So you will have comprehensive legislation that comes out of multiple committees and is done on a bipartisan basis. Senator Menendez this morning at a hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on China, and the House, by the way, is having a hearing on Friday on China. But Senator Menendez, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, said this morning that his committee would have a markup on April 14th of their China legislation. So here's the bottom line of it. Multiple committees in the Senate are going to write legislation that falls within their own jurisdiction. The problem is too comprehensive to fall within any one committee's jurisdiction. So each committee will act as it fits their own jurisdiction. They will send that work product out. They'll have a base bill on the floor. Schumer will take the work product of the various Senate committees, and these will be bipartisan work products, and he will offer it as a leadership substitute, and that will be debated and considered on the Senate floor toward the end of April. And I would think it would be done and out of the Senate before they go into a recess in early May. So this is going to be a very, very active year, and that's not the end of it, that's the beginning of it. Final statement. On the issue of the technology, I mean, it's the essence of that Schumer-Young bill. Okay, it's also the essence of a piece of legislation that Senator Mark Warner and Senator Rob Portman have worked on together. It's also a part of legislation that Senator Risch of Idaho, the ranking Republican on the Foreign Relations Committee, and Senator Romney have worked on. And it will be very much something that Senator Menendez contributes when the Foreign Relations Committee has its markup and so forth. So the idea that you're going to have international cooperation on technology issues will be a centerpiece of whatever legislation it is that the Senate passes. So I think we've got a lot to look forward to, and very soon.
Thanks for that,
And
Marty.
Matt, if I could just jump in here, Matt, I just can't help it just to underscore what Marty said. I mean, if you think about how really substantial this is, that in a completely polarized Congress, one of the most polarized we have ever seen in our history. I mean, it's historic polarization. When the leader looks up and says, what could we bring to the floor that we might possibly all agree on, because we need to kind of show some ability to do something like this, it's China. Like, think about that. I mean, 4 years ago, I don't think, Marty, that would have been possible, or Charles, I don't know, but there's such a consensus in the country from both parties that China is a challenge, and our business community needs our support. Big business, small business, the influence that it's having around the world is challenging our, values for democracy and a free press and human rights. And so it's really kind of an amazing, I think, Charles, I don't know how, or, Howard, how the House is, but to think that the Senate and that Schumer chose, of all the issues he could have chose, let's talk about China, because he can see that there's some kind of consensus brewing across committees, which is also unusual, Marty.
If I just add one thing here. Senator Young, who's been working very closely with Schumer on this, said this. He said the business community is good in dealing with applied research, but not necessarily good at dealing with basic research. Okay? That you had to have a public-private partnership in order to make that work, much as you did on the space program, right? And so that's one major hallmark of this, public-private partnership. And the other is the early measures that were taken against China were defensive measures, a sanction, for example, or a visa restriction, for example, something along that line. And the defensive measures will continue to be taken, but they are moving from purely defense to offense. And that's what I think the main focus of the Senate legislation will be. Not just a set of defensive measures, how can we crack down on China? Because nobody ultimately believes that cracking down on China by itself is sufficient unless the United States mobilizes its own resources and allied resources.
Can I just add one thing here? Oh.
Matt, okay, Matt. To Mary's point earlier, when the three of us were serving in Congress not that long ago, we could not even get a bill through both chambers dealing with currency manipulation, which was a hot button issue back in the early 2000s. So the fact of the matter is there has been a sea shift, or a big shift, a sea change in attitudes, and it's bipartisan to do something on China. The key is to get it right. And what is the right policy? Marty's absolutely correct. Just, hitting hard, pushing hard on defensive measures alone is insufficient. That's going to be an important element of a strategy. And in fact, if you look at a comprehensive strategy in dealing with China, there are basically four elements. To use the tariffs that are in place as leverage in dealing directly with China. Secondly, we'll be addressing all these vulnerabilities to supply chains, sabotage, surveillance, and so forth. And there are a number of things that can be done there. The third part is about our domestic economy. It's investing in education, it's investing in innovation, because we're still relying on old investments in innovation. China has already stepped up its investment. It's doubled it over the last decade in terms of what they're spending on innovation. And in their latest 5-year plan, they're going to bump it up even further. So we have to counter that. This is a Sputnik moment for us. So our domestic response is the third part of this. And then the final part is putting together effective multilateralism, not just process, but coalitions to deal with specific problems that garner the preponderance of leverage in dealing with China, whether it's in multilateral institutions or in the economic space with trade and investment, in technology standards. This 4-part strategy is what I think Congress is starting to settle around, but also the administration, I think, sees it in those terms as well. So thank you. And I'll turn back to Howard because I know I interrupted him earlier.
Congressman Berman, before you do, I know you want to speak. I wanted to add this for you to consider in your remarks. I know we all know that you chaired the House Foreign Affairs Committee from 2008 to 2011. I'm curious, as we've had this discussion of how there has, as Dr. Bustani said, there's been a sea change in this bipartisan mission. How have you noticed this as a former chair of the Committee of Jurisdiction? How have things changed from when you served as the chair to now? Would you add those insights as you comment?
I think there's a great deal more skepticism now than back in those days. that of China's evolution into a more mixed system, a greater amount of freedom for the individuals, and I just, at this particular point, and with this particular leadership in China, I think Marty Gold's point, which both of my panelists have also responded to, is key. This endless frontier legislation that Senator Schumer himself is co-sponsoring, was Senator Young and a Democrat and a Republican in the House, focuses not as a really more on what America needs to do in terms of new technologies, investments in basic research, using many of the programs that we had in the past, but in a much more comprehensive way and with an invigoration of significant amounts of money over a few years to not just make this defensive about how to respond to China, but how to do what we described about in the effort for the project to go to the moon, and over again in the past. And it has truly become a bipartisan issue that, and an administration issue. You haven't seen the administration come in and undo everything that the previous administration did. I think they're going to add a tremendous value in going through a process of working with allies, both in Europe and most importantly in the Far East. But those kinds of investments to make it about the competition and to ensure that we regain and maintain and expand our competitive advantages.
Thank you for that. Senator Landrieu, I want to come back to you. We talked a little about climate change. I want to flesh this out a tad and talk about linkage. We all know that there's rising tensions between our two countries, China and the United States. Despite all this, China's foreign minister recently signaled that he's open to working with the new administration on climate change. But he said this is contingent on U.S. adopting practical and rational China policies. In other words, Beijing will likely demand that U.S. soften its trade positions and military policies in exchange for China reducing carbon emissions. So it's more than likely that China will link climate change to some other priority that they have. I guess the question is, how do we work with China on this very important issue of climate change while maintaining some of our other postures that are extremely important? How do we avoid that linkage?
Well, I'm aware of what China has said and signaled, but we're also aware of how John Kerry, our leader on climate, representing President Biden, has responded. And he basically said, we're open to talks. We have a mutual interest in helping to cool this planet, but we're not going to kowtow or bow down to your description of what you believe is rational. We're going to stick to our values. So, I mean, it's going to be a tough negotiation, but I'll say this. China has its own interest in cleaning up its air and its water. It wants to keep its people happy working. People also are happy when they can drink clean water and breathe clean air. So China cannot just say, we're going to clean the environment because the U.S. wants us to. We're going to clean the environment and meet these accords because the people in China, although their free press is not as, not as active, people can't express. But if China wants to keep its people happy, it's got to keep its people healthy. And so they can't just say, we're not going to do anything. So, and they have a big problem. They're producing most of their electricity by coal. They're not using the new technologies. That's where the U.S. could really step up in this sort of endless frontier. Boy, investing in clean carbon technologies and new technologies to, not eliminate certain fuels, but make all fuels meet the new emission standards for net zero we could really have a great opportunity with China. In Louisiana, for instance, Charles and I know, we have a tremendous amount of clean natural gas. We can even get it cleaner. We can do stronger methane emissions. We can shift to a hydrogen-based economy. There's so many things that we can do with technology and investment to help our business community move along and share that appropriately with China. It helps them, it helps us. So it's going to be a tough negotiation, but I think China would be well advised to be working on this themselves if they want to keep their people healthy.
Thank you for that. Dr. Bustani, I want to, Senator Landrieu talked about technology. I want to shift over to technology to follow up on the conversation that Ambassador Huntsman had with Matthew Pottinger and Miles and Boyd. They talked a little about our competitive edge in the technology space. And, you know, here in Utah, we have a vibrant tech sector. Silicon Slopes is the crown jewel, I would say, of the nation. We rival any of the other hubs across this country. And, you know, it worries me in particular as we think about this as one who's worked very closely on tech policy over the years. I worry about whether or not we're losing our edge. And I'd like to get your insights on artificial intelligence. Think about 5G. I mean, how are we looking? Are we going to be able to keep up? You know, it's no secret that China would like to become the new technology capital of the world. And if we're not careful, they very well may accomplish that goal. So I'm curious to know your thoughts on how we, you know, I get it that we need to invest in STEM education. I understand all those issues, but what other things can we do? Shoring up our supply chains? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we've talked about the supply chains. We talked a little bit about education and really doubling down on STEM education, making sure that we're getting the best and brightest minds into the basic sciences and engineering, so that we'll have the full complement needed to have an innovative ecosystem. If we don't do the education piece, we're going to have problems. Similarly, I think having smart immigration policies. How often have we, learned of someone who was the son of an immigrant or an actual immigrant themselves who came into the United States? Maybe they were educated at a university here and they decided to stay and were responsible for some, major technological advance. We want the best and brightest in the United States. And so we need smart immigration policies. This has been a long-standing issue. Congress has just beat around the bush with it for the longest time. Certainly Howard and Mary and I know of all the ill-fated attempts to deal with this issue, but it needs to be addressed. But the country needs to be mobilized in a way that it hasn't been before about the need to take on the challenge that we're facing broadly. It's got to be a patriotic duty to push forward on education and get the proper investments in at every level, which means local communities and states are going to have to be a part of this push. The federal government can't carry the lift all together. The business community, for instance, supply chains are set up by business. Government sets broad policy, things like trade and investment agreements work, trade facilitation help, keep the costs down and so forth. One of the most important things that will have to happen in this fight, in this challenge with China, is to align business interests with American policy. Because if we're not aligned, we're going to be at a major disadvantage, because Xi Jinping can certainly align business in China. I mean, with their new national security law, even so-called private entities are subject to turning over information and cooperating completely with the central government in China. And so we can't do that in this country. I mean, that doesn't fit in our value system. But what we need to do is find ways to create better public-private partnerships and align the incentives of the business community with what our policy should be. And that way we're all rowing in the same direction to deal with this challenge.
Thank you for that. I couldn't agree more with you about the need for immigration reform, high-skilled immigration in particular. The last time we attempted that was in 2013. Congress. I was then with Senator Hatch on the Senate Judiciary Committee. At that time, I had more hair. I lost a lot of hair during those many months of trying to negotiate that bill. But what a loss, because we could have had so much, accomplished so much with the high-skilled immigration, where you say keeping the best and the brightest here, as well as even comprehensive and helping those who should stay here and contribute to our nation's economy. I'm very mindful of the time that we have. We could go on. I know we're just getting started and I hate to end this, but we do need to wrap it up. So I want to do a rapid fire question to all of you. And we'll start with Marty and then go to Senator Landrieu and then Congressman Berman and end with you, Dr. Boustany. And here's the question, and let's just keep it brief and crisp here. What makes you hopeful about the future of U.S. China relations? Because we have been a little negative here today. Let's see if there's some optimism that we can infuse in this conversation. And what makes you concerned? And I think what I would like to hear in particular is maybe something dealing with human rights. We might want to touch upon that too. So Marty, and then Senator Landrieu, Congressman Berman, and then we'll end with you, Dr. Boustany.
Well, China is not the Soviet Union. Okay, that makes me optimistic. China presents some great opportunities for the United States. There are ways we could work with China. If we could work with them, for example, on climate change without the linkage Senator Landrieu was talking about, okay? We could work with them on public health problems. If we could work with them on nuclearization issues, particularly on the Korean Peninsula, those have an intrinsic value all by themselves, but beyond that, they can be confidence building measures for working in other areas if you are actually able to be successful in these areas and if you can get commitments that people will follow through on. On the other hand, to be honest about this, the vision that Xi Jinping has for China is that China will be restored to the dominant role it had on the world stage prior to the mid-19th century. China was the richest economy in the world at the end of the 18th century. When the United States was first getting started as a country, China had 1/3 of the world's economy. When those of us grew up in the 20th century, understood China as poor, understood China in turmoil, understood that China was somehow backward, and that China was struggling to get back to some kind of standard of living for its people, and that most of its people were living in poverty. Well, that's not China now, and it certainly is not the China that the Communist Party leadership has in mind as they move forward in the 20th century. By the time the People's Republic of China is 100 years old in 2049, they mean to be not only dominant in their region, but I would judge dominant in the world. So it presents, it isn't necessarily even per se an anti-American thing, as it is what they believe to be a restoration of their own proper role within the world. That just happens to have a contradiction to American interests. So the United States just has to understand where China wants to go, has to understand that China is not easily confined, that China doesn't live in its own narrow ecosystem like the Soviet Union did. Okay? It has to understand that if it's going to compete, it has got to get its own house in order. But I'll just say one other thing. We got great dividends out of the space program after we competed with the Soviet Union after Sputnik. And those dividends rippled all through American life. So just like having a pace horse on a racetrack, basically, okay, it will benefit American society in great many ways because we have that competition with China. And if we are fortunate and we do things right, we'll also win the competition.
I would agree with everything that Marty said. I think he's outlined some areas where there could be some really positive development. I would just add, I guess, in concern is here in the United States, I think many people, this is a little political, but I think it's an accurate description of where we are. Many people in our own country are questioning what a free press looks like, are criticizing a free press, are questioning what a democratic government's role should be. And it's concerning, because America needs to be confident in our democracy, that our government is not the enemy, that there's a great partnership between our faith-based community, our government, and our democracy, that a free press, it may not be what you like to hear as a politician, they may criticize you, but in the end, having a strong free press is just fundamental to, that tell the truth, that understand evidence, et cetera, is really important to a democracy. Facts matter. And you can't just have your own set of facts. You can have your own set of opinions, but not your own set of facts. So I worry that while we're trying to address China, we have some real internal issues we've got to come to grips with. On a positive side, the fact that both parties are kind of leaning forward together to come up with the plans that we've talked about today, or some of the framework for China, is very encouraging, that we can find a path forward. And clearly on the energy front, there are, investments and challenges and innovations that we could do some great work with them. Environment and energy.
The positive, from my point of view, is illustrated by the report that Catherine Tai has been confirmed by a vote of 98-0. A lot of it is about her, but it's about a larger issue too, that notwithstanding the events of recent years on the issue of American sort of economic, national security and values interests, and a bipartisan coalition is forming. Serious people are taking key positions on China policy in the administration. There's a understanding of a need to bring in allies, and that and a relatively united Congress with an executive branch that has wants to lead on this issue is positive. The negative for me is the concerns that some of the issues that have always been talked about in terms of China and could lead to certain military actions. I'm nervous about the situation in Taiwan. I hear rhetoric that is more strident than before, maneuvers and decisions that are made. As the Ambassador Huntsman pointed out, we have a forward-looking strategy as a part of our national defense strategy. And can things go wrong in this space, and all of a sudden we have confrontations that create big national problems? And in some ways, rhetoric and events of the recent years and very recently make me more concerned about than I was before.
That what gives me great hope and a positive outlook on this is something I remember back around 2013, shortly after Xi Jinping took the reins of power in China. I happened to be there in China with Congressman Rick Larsen. We were co-chairing a delegation as part of the U.S. China Working Group in the House. We were co-chairs, and Rick and I were in the vehicle driving to a meeting, and we saw a group of millennials on the streets of Beijing wearing Western clothes, very nice things that they were buying maybe in Paris or in New York or wherever. And Rick turned to me and said, the biggest challenge for Xi Jinping is how does he keep those people satisfied? And the issues that China will have to confront are a demographic that's working against them to sustain the kind of growth and productive economy that satisfies all those folks. So I think our soft power and our ability to project soft power, if we don't mess it up, is something that gives me tremendous hope, because it will appeal to that generation of Chinese at the end of the day. what keeps me up at night are two things. One, Howard mentioned one of them, that some mishap occurs in the South China Sea or East China Sea, and then it escalates and things really go bad for everybody. And the second is a broader, longer term issue, and that is the fear on my part that the United States will grow weary of its international leadership role and will turn inward. Because without U.S. leadership, the Europeans will be adrift, the Japanese will be lost and feel abandoned. Others in the Asia-Pacific region might feel abandoned. So there's a vital role for Americans to have an internationalist outlook and to put the right kind of policies in place so that we actually move things forward in this regard. So bringing all that back together, looking at how Biden and his team will manage things, they're going to try to cooperate where they can, and there are areas that are open for cooperation, but it's going to take careful diplomacy and a certain amount of leverage. There are going to be areas where we're going to confront China, and those are going to be clear red lines on human rights and on security issues. And then there's going to be this big area where we're going to have to compete. Biden calls it extreme competition, and he's right. And this is going to be a competition of the 21st century. And this is where the United States has to step up and produce on all cylinders, on domestic and international, education and innovation. I'm hopeful because I know that the United States has been able to adapt in the past to challenges. I'm hopeful that we can adapt today.
Thank you for that, Dr. Bustani. On that, we will bring today's panel to a close. And I just want to thank all of you for joining us. I hope our viewers fully appreciate what we've had today to bring on so many of you together, with your rich experiences and your insights have been really just once in a lifetime. So thank you for your time. We know that you're busy, and we also want to thank the viewers across the country who joined us today. Please know that as a reminder, we will be sending out a recording of today's event, and please be sure to sign up for next Wednesday's webinar focused on China's economic and trade policy and what it means for U.S. businesses. That will be Wednesday, March 24th. Again, thank you for joining us. We appreciate everyone who's participated on today's program. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank you.